All right, so we're going to be covering 1 Corinthians chapter 8 through 10 tonight. And you'll recall from previous studies that there was a letter written to Paul from the church at Corinth, and they had at least 4 questions. There may have been more questions than that, but at least 4 questions. And these were very, very important questions. So one was about, what about marriage? What about sex and marriage? What about if you are married to an unbeliever? Do you stay married? Should you leave? What about if your spouse dies? Pretty important stuff. Then there's one about what if we have spiritual gifts? How do we handle that process? And then there's one about money. Money's always important. But then there's an odd one that we'll cover tonight. And you can see Don's slides. He's very creatively called it, "What's for dinner?" Okay? And so the question had to do about eating food. Now, not just are you keto or carnivore or vegan. No, this is about what about eating food that's been offered to idols? Should you do that? Should you not do it? Does it depend on the context? In other words, if you go to the market and buy food, what if somebody invites you to their house? What if you go to a temple, some pagan temple, and eat food there? What should you do? And so, again, it may seem a little odd to take up 3 chapters with this. We have chapter 8, where he introduces it. Then chapter 9 almost seems out of place. Paul will talk about, here, all my rights I have as a preacher. But really that ties in with this question of eating meat offered to idols. And then we'll sort of end with chapter 10. So there'll be a pretty fast pace, and we're not going to be going verse by verse here. But I just want to pop these questions up. This is sort of the trigger for the questions that Paul was asked. He'll say in the book, "Now concerning." So chapter 7 was about marriage. We have chapter 12 concerning spiritual gifts. Chapter 16 will be collection or money. And then we have chapter 8, now concerning food offered to idols. And the way that Don has broken this up, which I think is very accurate, is there are 3 groups of people that are under consideration in these chapters. So the first group are those with a lot of knowledge, and they are conceited, they're arrogant, because they know what's right, and it seems as if they are kind of looking down on those who maybe don't have that same knowledge. And then we have a group that we could call the conscientious group, and they're wondering, what do I do? Do I eat meat offered to idols? What about if I'm with somebody? What if I'm at dinner and somebody tells me, oh, by the way, this was offered to idols? What should I do? Maybe there's a weaker brother that's with me. So what do I do? And then we have a group that we can just call sort of the confused. They're going, I don't know what to do. I think idols are nothing. Remember, a lot of these people would have come out of a background with a lot of idolatry. But maybe now I know that there's nothing to idols, but what do I do if this meat's been offered to idols? And it seems as if most of the meat, and we're specifically talking about meat, but it could be any food, but most of the meat in that city probably in some way was connected with idolatry. And so we can see this is not just some theoretical question. This is a very serious question. Hey, if I go down to the marketplace and buy meat, can I eat that? I go to somebody's house. Can I eat that? Can I go to a temple and in the sort of the dining hall of the temple? Can I eat meat? So that's what we're dealing with here. So we can divide this up into those 3 groups, but there's 2 broad themes. And we'll see here that we've got knowledge. Okay, so there's a group who they know with certainty that idols are meaningless. So it could be a 100-foot tall idol or a tiny little idol. Doesn't matter. Made out of wood, made out of stone, made out of precious metal. Doesn't matter. It's meaningless. There's nothing to that. Okay? And so we have people that know that. If we think about it logically, if this little idol, if we put some meat in front of it and this idol is nothing, then what effect does that have on the meat? If the idol is nothing? Yeah, no effect. I mean, I could say, this is Zeus, and put some meat in front of it and bless it, and it doesn't change the meat. Okay? So we have this idea of knowledge. And as we go through this, we're going to mainly focus on the topic at hand, which is meat offered to idols. But let's also think at a higher level. We could have knowledge about other things that we say, well, I know this is right, or I know that this is wrong. And how does that relate to our brothers and sisters? Because the other part of this is love. So we may know something is right or something is wrong, but we also have to layer on top of that love. And love for who? Who do we need to consider as we make decisions in daily life? Yeah, other people, right? Other Christians, even non-Christians, our neighbors, our family. So it's not just a matter of, well, I know this is absolutely right, and I have every right to do this. But we need to consider what's the effect on other people. So here's the apostle's answer. He says in verse 1, and we'll just look at a few of these verses here. He says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And then look at verse 4. Therefore, as to eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and there is no God but one. So we can look at this and say, the truth of the matter is idols are meaningless, okay? And so whatever you put in front of the idol, it's like putting it in front of a brick or putting it in front of a car or a computer. It doesn't make any difference. So these people knew that idols were wrong, but they also, at least some of them knew, that idols were meaningless. And so we have knowledge can produce prideful behavior. So if we go back to verse 1, we know all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So he's drawing a distinction here. If we just have knowledge without love, what that can do is make us arrogant, conceited, and say, well, I'm going to do what I want to do regardless of any effect on anybody else. But love is there to build each other up, to help each other get to heaven. So verse 4, it needs to be motivated by love. Knowledge allows personal liberty. So let's look at this. Verse 5, although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth. Verse 6, yet for us there is one God, the Father. Look at verse 7, however, not all possess this knowledge, but some through former association with idols. So those would be people that either used to worship idols or they had a lot of experience living in a city filled with idolatry. They eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. So look at this. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do eat. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. So we understand if we have this true knowledge about the subject here, meat offered to idols, it doesn't mean anything. We can eat it, not eat it, doesn't matter. Except we've got to layer that idea of love on there because we may have a weaker brother that this does affect. So love is required to guide that liberty. So I have this liberty, I have this right, but should I do it? Even though I have the right to do it, should I do it? And then sacrificing liberty may save others. So look at verse 13. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So he just said in 4 verses before that, whether you eat meat, don't eat meat, doesn't mean anything. And now he's saying, but if eating meat will make my brother stumble, what will he do? Yeah, I won't eat it. Even though I have the right to eat it, If it's going to cause you to stumble, I'm not going to do it. Or if you eating meat will cause me to stumble, then you will refrain. Even though you have the right to eat it, love would compel you to say, I'll give that up. Okay? So let's look now at this idea of everything that's right is not necessarily good. And this is let's jump down to chapter 10, verse about 23. Chapter 10. And so he says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. And so there can be things that are right, that are allowable, that we certainly have God's discretion that He gives to us, say you can do this, but it may not be helpful to our brothers and sisters. And so we've got to factor that in. So look at verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Now again, He's already established it is totally fine to eat meat offered to idols. But if you're going to eat, make sure that you're doing that to the glory of God. In other words, if you would cause a brother to stumble, what should you do? Just refrain from eating that. All right, so let's look here at this connection with other Christians, because we can have a tendency, especially in our country, to say, I have my rights, and that's all that matters. I don't care about you. You know, you may be weak, you may not have the same knowledge as me. I have the right to do this, and nobody can tell me what to do in my own house, or in a restaurant, or somebody else's house, or on my job, or in my family. And that is not the picture we get from Paul in this book. So verse 24, he says of chapter 10, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. And so when we are taking actions, and what we're talking about under consideration here, it's very similar to Romans chapter 14. We are not talking about things that are sinful. If they're sinful, do we have to go through some deep analysis about whether to do them? Right. If it's sinful, we don't do it. So he's talking about things that are not sinful, but it could have an effect on somebody. And that's where we've got to put that love into the mix and say, I know I have the right to do this, but should I do this? And maybe the answer is no. And that means I have to give up a right that I have. So verse 24 again, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Look at Romans 12. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. So this is not something where we need to walk around with an arrogant attitude of, well, I've figured that out, and so it doesn't matter that you're confused on it. All that matters is I know that I can do this. That would be a very arrogant approach. That's not being very neighborly. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Is that the message that our society preaches today? That you should put other people's interests before yours? No. You know, we are very fond of the airplane illustration, aren't we? When you're on the airplane, they say, in the event that we lose pressure, what will come down from the ceiling? Oxygen mask. And they say, now, put it on your child first, right? Is that what they say? No, they say, put it on yourself first. And that makes sense in that context. But we like to take that and say, see, it's all about me. Like, I come first. My desires come first. As long as I'm not sinning, my desires come first. That's not what Paul is saying here. But in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. So let's go back to chapter 10. Eat whatever's sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner, you're disposed to go. Eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. So let's put that in our own language. What is Paul saying? If you get invited to somebody's house and they put some meat in front of you, Should you ask questions about was this offered to an idol, or should you stay silent? Yeah, stay silent. He says, don't raise any question about it, okay? But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then what should we do? So again, the context is we're at an unbeliever's house. He puts meat in front of us. If he doesn't say anything, we eat it. If he says, oh, by the way, we offered this to Zeus, and I bought it from the temple of Zeus, and here it is. What should you do then? Now remember, idols are meaningless. What does he say to do?
If you're a Christian and you're trying to educate a non-believer, then you shouldn't eat.
Yeah, so this non-believer may have told us, hey, this is offered to an idol, and maybe they're wondering what we will do. Maybe there's a weaker brother there. But Paul's very clear about it. If someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. And we'll come back to this verse. He says, not your conscience really, but the conscience of the other people. Okay? So give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. Okay, so follow my example. Let's look here at chapter 9, because when we're reading this in sort of a flow, we've got chapter 8, and then it's almost like there's this hard turn in chapter 9. And all of a sudden he starts talking about, here are my rights as a preacher. And, you know, we sometimes go, well, that's kind of random. He sticks that in there, and then chapter 10, he continues to talk about eating meat offered to idols. But chapter 9, while everything it says is certainly true, it's really just an example that he's trying to say, look at what I do here. So look at 9, chapter 9, verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? Look at verse 4. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Verse 5. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? And they give some examples. So he's talking about, as somebody who's preaching, don't I have the right to be paid for doing this spiritual work? So verse 7, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? And then he's anticipating, they say, well, Paul, where'd you come up with this? So verse 8, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? And then he goes all the way back to the law of Moses. Verse 9, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Now, why would you not want to muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain? What would that prevent the ox from doing?
When the ox was treading out the grain, if he had a muzzle on, he couldn't take his bite of the grain. They said, don't do that.
Yeah, so God had said in the law, if you have an ox that's grinding this grain, make sure you let that ox eat from it. In other words, there's a principle. If you're doing work, you should be able to participate in that. And then he says at the end of verse 9, is it for oxen God is concerned? Well, in some ways the answer would be yes. We do see God's concern for animals all throughout the Old Testament. But really there's this bigger point here. Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not, or do not we even more? So Paul has made the point here, as an apostle, as a preacher, that he has every right to be paid by the congregation for the work that he's done. But notice what he says in verse 13. Do you not know that those who are employed in temple service get their food from the temple, those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offering? In the same way, the Lord commanded those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So it's pretty powerful rights there. Verse 15, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. So he says, I don't get paid by you guys. And don't think this letter is me asking you to send money. I'm not asking you to do that. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I'm still entrusted with stewardship. And then he goes on and talks about sort of what he gets out of this. But the point of chapter 9 is, he's saying, I have the right to expect money from the congregations that I preach for. I'm giving up that right. And how did Paul support himself? Yeah, he made tent. Now, there were certainly occasions where there was money sent, and we'll see that in other passages, but by and large, he supported himself. And he preached without taking money for the preaching. And so he says, I had the right to expect you guys to pay me, but I chose to give up that right. So again, this is not randomly put in here. This is going back to chapter 8. Okay, idols are nothing, meaningless. And so I certainly have the right as a Christian who has knowledge to say, it doesn't matter if you offer meat to an idol. It doesn't change the character. It doesn't alter the DNA. It doesn't make it spiritually unclean. But if I have a brother who maybe is not as knowledgeable, and that might lead them down a bad path, then I give up that right. Okay? Yes, sir.
Let's just for my own problem, explain to the congregation what a double honor, speaking of an elder, is worthy of double honor. Tell them what that means. Okay,
so the question is about, there's a description of elders who preach being worthy of double honor, and so as I understand it, that would be an elder who's also a preacher. So elders can be supported, preachers can be supported. If you're an elder and a preacher, you could be sort of supported twice, okay? But certainly Paul is saying for any right that we have, okay, again, we're not talking about something we're obligated to do. So we wouldn't say, well, I'm going to give up taking the Lord's Supper on Sunday. Well, no, you can't do that. And we're not talking about sin. We're talking about things that God gives us discretion to do. But I may give up those rights in order to not offend a brother. And we'll see some passages here from Romans 14 in a minute, or we'll flip to them here. So remember, Paul has said, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. That will be chapter 11, verse 1. So the very next verse after our chapters. And so here's his example, his answer. And Don makes a point, look, we have different backgrounds. We come from different perspectives, different experiences. So let's think about, in the church at Corinth, what if I'm somebody that was never tempted by idols? I mean, I always knew idols were just garbage, okay? Nothing to them. But the brother that I'm close to, he came out of that background. And so he now realizes idolatry is horrible. You know, an elder taught me many, many years ago, the fastest way to enrage God is to give credit to an idol for what God has done. You go back through the Old Testament, God is just furious about that sort of stuff. He ultimately destroyed the northern kingdom. He took the southern kingdom, sort of ran them through the meat grinder, and got rid of idolatry. Okay? So idolatry is horrible in the Bible. So somebody that was caught up in idolatry and now has come out of it, they may say, I think I need to stay as far away from idolatry as possible. Even though if they had better knowledge, they would understand that idol is meaningless. And so in that context, we would say, I'll give up my right to eat meat. What would be a modern day application of this? I mean, presumably at Publix, we're not buying meat that was offered to Zeus or Apollos or somebody like that. So what would be a modern day example of this principle? Yes, ma'am.
If someone is an alcoholic, and we experience that Christians don't drink anyway. But
Yeah, that's a great example. So let's say that, and let me preface it by, we're not going to answer the question in this class about, is social drinking okay? Is it wise? Is it smart? Just hypothetically assume that there's nothing wrong with quote, social drinking. But you have a family member who is a recovering alcoholic. And so you drink in front of them. Well, now, what's the temptation to that person who's a recovering alcoholic?
he's going to partake with them.
Yeah, well, let me partake, and that may get them off the wagon. Now, full disclosure, I think any consumption of alcohol is incredibly unwise, okay? But again, that's not our topic for this. But let's say we have the right to do something, but that's going to tempt somebody to doing something wrong, to violating their conscience. So let's take another example. What if there is a movie that I want to watch? And say that movie's a little rough, whatever that may be, language or violence or whatever it may be. And just assume I know I can watch that with no harm to me. But maybe another brother, it would be very troubling for them to watch it. And they see me on social media going, oh, you got to watch this movie. It's the greatest movie. And I come into the church building, oh, it's the greatest movie. You got to watch it. And this person's like, I don't think I should watch it, but John keeps talking about it. So I guess it must be okay. And then they watch a movie that their conscience tells them they should not watch. And assume God doesn't care whether they watch the movie or not, but they violated their conscience. What happens when we violate our conscience? What's that called? Sin. If we violate our conscience. Now, our conscience may be wrong, so just because our conscience isn't violated doesn't mean we're right, but every time we violate our conscience, we're sinning, we're wrong. And so we have to think about, there may be something that I know, because of my knowledge, is okay, but for somebody else, that may be a problem. And so if I'm going to influence them to do something that they think is wrong, then I've got to be willing to give up my right. Just like Paul was willing to give up his right to be paid. And we'll see in other places, he talks about, basically, I don't want to lose any credibility with you guys by taking money, okay? And so he had a reason for doing that. But we can think in terms of, we're not islands to ourselves. We're not just, I get to make every decision based solely on me. Okay? If we're a family, what do we say here? I don't think I have one, but what's the thing called on Sunday mornings we get? The what report? Isn't it like the family report? Okay? And, from the podium we'll talk about, this is a church family. Well, if it's a family, then we need to be concerned about each other. And I don't need to insist on doing just what I want if I know that's going to harm somebody else. And so that is a much broader principle than just specifically meat offered to idols. Yes, sir.
I just want to share briefly. There was a good friend of mine, an elder named Stan Dudley, years ago. And Stan said, we must do what we know is right and cannot be wrong. And I thought that was so good, because it sort of helped me try to understand these things better, the things that you're selling us and talking about in the class. Because I truly believe there is a way to know what you know will be right. I think two things. One might be one we know would please God. So I wanted to just share that.
Yeah, that's a great sort of rule or model that an elder shared about if we stick with things that we know are right, as opposed to maybe some things that are a little questionable, And so the only thing I would sort of layer on top of that is, even though we may know something's right, if it will cause a weaker brother to sin, then we've got to give up that. Now, again, we're not talking about a requirement. If we don't say, well, if I take the Lord's Supper, that's going to cause somebody to sin. Well, I still need to take the Lord's Supper. Yes, sir. I'll come back to you.
I think we have to be very careful about the modern examples we apply in this context, because we can possibly equip or weaponize those who are ultra sensitive to certain topics to then become very like policing of other Christians and really put burdens upon Christians that do not need to be or should not be burdens and discourage others. There are many young preachers who get into the role of being a preacher, and because of the mass of people around them with their opinions on what is right to do or what's expected of them, then the person can become crushed because then they're trying to please all those around them, and they're guilt-ridden by causing others to possibly stumble. And so I think we do have to be very cautious about the examples, the modern examples we apply to this, and also going back to the first verse, love edifies. Those who are offended, we must carefully and lovingly teach them what the scriptures say and what they don't say, and help people to come out of possibly being oversensitive to things that are really innocent.
Yeah, so two great points. One, if somebody lacks knowledge, remember we had sort of the group that knew, the group that was conscientious, the group that was confused. If somebody lacks knowledge, let's just stick with the specific example here, meat offered to idols. Well, then we need to lovingly teach them, hey, that idol is really nothing, okay? So that was the first point. Very good. Second point is we need to make sure that we are not sort of giving veto power to somebody who says, I want to impose all my requirements on everybody else. And that's an excellent point. And let's think about this. So I'll give you sort of the classic example. And this comes from Romans 14, but it's really the same here in this passage. And so this is, some of you may be old enough to remember, there was a time where a lot of Christians thought that playing cards was sinful. This would be a problem for Kathy because she has what do y'all play? What's it called? Yeah, everything. Okay. So the story goes, there's a preacher, and this lady comes up to him after Sunday night and says, well, are you going to Kathy's house? I'm using Kathy as an example. Going to Kathy's house to play cards? Why, yes, I am. And she said, well, you're not allowed to do that under Romans 14 because I think that's sinful. And so the preacher said, well, by me going, will that cause you to go and violate your conscience? She said, I would never play cards. He said, this is not Romans 14. And he went. So we're not saying that under 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 or Romans 14 that if I have some sort of peculiar sensitivity that I get to impose that on everybody. What we're talking about is a weaker brother who says, I think this would be sin, whatever it is, playing cards, eating meat offered to idols, watching this particular movie, whatever it may be. And by you doing it, that's going to cause me to say, well, I guess I need to do it. Okay, it's not somebody goes, I would never play cards, so you can't play cards. It would be, I'm going to now go do this, and I will sin. Well, if that's the case, then we need to refrain from that. And we also need to teach that person, whatever the subject matter is. If they have a misunderstanding of God's law, there needs to be teaching. But we want to be very careful, because we are a family, we're a community, to not do something that would then lead a weaker brother, who by definition doesn't have the same knowledge, a weaker brother to engage in activity that would violate his or her conscience. I think you had a question.
I think it's a little more difficult as a Christian if there's something that is totally legitimate for me to do, and I think it's wrong, and I do it, then I violated my conscience, and that's wrong.
Yeah, so the point is, anything we do to violate our conscience, that's a bad position to be in. Now, the conscience is not like our DNA, we're born with it, and I got my conscience. No, a conscience can be trained, right? We exercise discernment, and as we learn something is right, we go, okay, that's right. We learn something's wrong, we go, okay, that's wrong. It's kind of like we're feeding data into our conscience, and now our conscience can sort of at a gut level tell us, I don't think that's right, or I think that's okay. And so that conscience can be misguided, but We constantly need to learn. That's why we're in Bible classes. That's why we have sermons. That's why on our own we study the Bible. We read the Bible. We think about this. We wrestle with some of these issues. I've wondered before, how come this particular passage in whatever place it is, why isn't it more clear? Well, maybe the answer is God needed me to wrestle with that, to struggle, to think about it and go, well, is it this or is it that? And let me really go back and forth on this, because that will improve me. And so, did I see another hand here? Did you have a follow-up on that?
I have many follow-ups. I think that's what you shared is so important. Like this is where, it comes down to the crux of, do we have a heart for Christ? Do we have a heart for one another? And so to carefully try to navigate this with love for others is where the motivation needs to be. Not from a perspective of, well, I'm right and I have this right, or you're wrong and you can't do this. However, going back to those examples that you gave of peculiarities or something, peculiar views, to a lot of people, they feel like their view is not peculiar, but it's hard, fast, like that's sin or it's not sin. And
right.
So then they do want to impose it on you. And then we enter into this equipping of Pharisees almost. And so there does need to be that loving teaching, and not, in some of those cases, not possibly, this will sound hard-headed, but not possibly bending to their will in order to boost their false sense of what is true and what is not true, but to lovingly teach them, look, you're holding people to something that is just not found in the Scripture, and you got to let go of it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So what we're talking about in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, what we're talking about in Romans 14, are things that God doesn't really care about. If they were sin, then we wouldn't put those in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. We wouldn't put those in Romans 14. If they're sin, they're just sin. Now, what we're talking about is when it's something God doesn't care about, but a weaker brother thinks it's wrong, and there will be influence. Oh, she did this. I don't think I should be doing this, but she did it, so I guess I'm going to do it. Now we're in Romans 14, or now we're in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. If it's something where somebody goes, well, I'm never going to do that, but I'm just telling you, you are wrong. Well, then let's study that, okay? But you don't have to refrain. I don't have to refrain from doing something. We just study that and try to figure out what is God's commandment on this? What are His laws on this? So it's very, very important, in my view, to keep 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 and Romans 14, which has been over the decades sort of a source of a lot of controversy, in my view, because people are putting things that God does care about in Romans 14. Well, let's put baptism in Romans 14. Let's put the Lord's Supper in Romans 14. No, these are things that God doesn't care about. You can do them, not do them. Just like He said, if you don't eat meat, you're not any better off for it. If you do eat meat, you're not any worse off for it. Like, eat it or not eat it, okay? So, is that the first bell? Okay. So, let's see here. We'll just go through, we've covered this in Romans 14. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Why do you despise? Don't put a stumbling block in front of them. And so, I like this point, and we'll end with this, that having the right to do something, to eat meat offered to idols, to watch a particular show, to whatever it may be, play cards, after Sunday night, that doesn't make it right. In other words, it may be something that I have to back off of. And that can be hard for us. Now, if this guy has something that he knows he can do, and this lady, it will cause her to sin, it's very easy for me to go, brother, you need to give that up. Now, if she needs me to give something up, well, wait a minute. That's a different matter. I mean, this is my right, okay? I mean, it's one thing if it's your right, but my rights are more important. That's where we have to be very, very careful and say, I would rather give something up and have my brother or sister go to heaven than me to keep doing something, and I'm in some small way, or maybe large way, responsible for their faith being shipwrecked. That would be a very bad situation. So I encourage you, read through these chapters. Again, see chapter 9 as an example, an illustration of Paul saying, I have all these rights, I give them up. Read chapter 8, read chapter 10. So Wednesday night, we'll do something totally different from 1 Corinthians, unless I change my mind, but I think that's what we'll do. And so there's nothing really to do to prepare for it. Just think about what we've talked about tonight. And then I think rolling back around to Sunday, Don should be back. And I don't think he's going straight into chapter 11. Probably he'll go into chapter 12 and then circle back to chapter 11 a little bit later. So thank you for your comments and attention. And we will see you Wednesday night.